They called themselves the Zarthans, the apex. Claws of the galaxy. Born of steel, bred for war, evolved through eons of domination. In the far corners of the spiral arms, their name wasn't spoken in fear. It was accepted like gravity. Unchangeable. Undefeated. Until the day the sky broke. The alert came as a whisper, a distortion, a pulse from the void beyond map space. The outermost relay stations picked it up. First thought it was solar interference. Then quantum analysts noticed the pattern. Buried beneath the static was language. Purposeful. Old yet precise. A code not seen in 10,000 years. A code not written by any known species. Not anymore. The Zarthan Enclave responded as they always did, with overwhelming presence. A response fleet of 50 warships was dispatched to the unclaimed fringe. What they found was not a fleet. Not a signal station. Not even a satellite. Just a single vessel. Black as the void. Silent. Motionless. As if it had been waiting. Scans returned nothing. No emissions. No power. No life. But the ship's structure was unlike anything catalogued. It ignored conventional physics. Exterior plating didn't reflect energy, it consumed it. The front bore no weapons. No name. Just a symbol scorched into the hull, a simple, inverted triangle encased in a ring. 3 claws of it were chipped and faded, as though burned by time. And below it, barely visible, one word etched in an ancient tongue that made Zarthan translators shudder. ***. Earth. They approached with caution. No challenge was issued. No movement detected. Then, without provocation or reason, the ship woke up. Only for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the Zarthan fleet, vessels built with 6-tier redundancies, quantum shield layers, and AI reflex matrices, shut down completely. Dead in space. No lights. No engines. No thought. And in that darkness, every crew member heard the same whisper in their mind. You were not first. The ship powered down again. Everything returned to normal. No attack. No pursuit. Just silence. But silence, the Zarthans would later say, had never screamed so loud. The fleet returned shaken. Not by firepower, they had seen power before. No, it was the ease. The effortless way this relic turned them into prey. Something ancient. Something patient. Something watching. Reports flooded in. Debate raged across Zarthan High Command. Was this a lost weapon from a forgotten war? An AI gone rogue? But the data didn't lie. The signal, the symbol, the name, all pointed to one species. One erased from existence 10 millennia ago. A species written off as a tragic curiosity. A death world-born anomaly that flared too hot, too fast, and was consumed by its own ambition. Humans. The word hadn't passed through a Zarthan tongue in centuries. And when it did, it felt like blasphemy. The strongest species in the galaxy, those who had never known defeat, had encountered a ghost from a myth. And that myth had humbled them without lifting a finger. Some demanded war. Others demanded silence. But the ruling caste chose fear masked as control. They ordered immediate investigation, summoning ancient records from the galactic core. Across 1,000 systems, archives were scoured, looking for fragments, hints, whispers of the long-lost humans. And in those dusty records they found things that didn't make sense. Unconfirmed expeditions. Signals long thought to be anomalies. Artifacts hidden under quarantine protocols no one remembered authorizing. Even their own language held borrowings no one could explain. Humanity wasn't forgotten. It had been buried. Across fringe colonies, old machines powered on. Forgotten satellites blinked back to life. Dormant AIs hummed beneath the crust of forgotten moons. All bearing that same inverted triangle. That same name etched into steel like a warning, Earth. And then came the second signal. This time not from the relic ship, but from everywhere at once. A tight band pulse synchronized across light years. Contained in it one message. No demands. No threats. Just a phrase. We remember everything. The Enclave's confidence cracked. They weren't used to riddles. They were used to obedience, conquest, domination. And yet here was a force that didn't threaten, didn't boast, didn't even acknowledge them directly. A force that simply was. On the day the Council reconvened to decide what action to take, every starship in orbit above their capital experienced a brief system reset. Exactly 1.2 seconds. Nothing catastrophic. But in those 1.2 seconds, every screen, console, and visor displayed a rotating image. The human symbol. And beneath it, in clean, clinical font. You were never alone. That night, thousands of Zarthans didn't sleep. They didn't dream. They remembered. Memories not their own. Images of blue oceans, vast cities, fire and glass, love and war, creation and extinction. Human memories. As if something had touched their minds. No one spoke openly about it. But fear spread. True fear. Not of death, but of irrelevance. The apex had stood alone for eons. And now, something older had stirred. Something they couldn't dominate. Couldn't understand. The strongest species in the galaxy had always believed in superiority through power. But now power looked different. Silent. Subtle. Unstoppable. The humans hadn't returned with armies. They returned with presence. And nothing would ever be the same. The Zarthans had built an empire not through diplomacy or science, but by mastering the art of fear. Their dominance wasn't theoretical, it was absolute. They were engineered perfection. For lungs, triple-layered exoskeletons, minds bred in brood vats where only the most ruthless survived. In war, they didn't negotiate, they extinguished. Entire species had vanished under their boots, and no one questioned it. No one dared. Their superiority was more than physical, it was institutional. Every Zarthan child was trained from hatch to view other species as lesser. Peace was weakness. Mercy was betrayal. The galaxy was a food chain, and they stood at the top. That belief had held for centuries, unchallenged, untested. Until the relic ship appeared. Now, for the first time in generations, the apex predators felt uncertainty. And for them, that was far worse than fear. The Supreme Alpha, ruler of the Enclave, summoned the High Stratums to an emergency conclave. He stood on his war cradle platform, claws twitching, voice slicing through the chamber like a weapon. "We are being observed," he said. "And we do not understand the observer." Across the galaxy, fleets were rerouted. Science vessels repurposed into search crafts. Thousands of analysts were assigned to dissect every known scrap of data about the extinct species known as humans. At first, it seemed laughable. All records pointed to a brief, chaotic existence. Humanity had appeared out of nowhere, burned quickly, then vanished. No battles. No confirmed homeworld after its disappearance. Just rumors and a handful of unverified sensor logs. But the more they dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Too many lost probes near Old Earth's location. Too many unexplained data silences. Too many minor civilizations that spoke of the old giants, or the Fireborn. One record, retrieved from a dying merchant AI, contained a strange quote in its corrupted memory banks. "Humanity is the question the universe has not yet answered." The more they searched, the more the Zarthans realized humanity hadn't vanished. It had erased itself. Not through war. Through choice. And that terrified them more than any weapon. A decision was made. A covert team would be dispatched to the last known coordinates of Earth. Not an assault fleet. A retrieval unit. Elite, quiet, surgical. Their mission, recover anything of value. DNA samples. AI cores. Cultural data. Secrets. They launched under darkness, unannounced, buried in bureaucratic silence. As far as the public knew, nothing had happened. The Supreme Alpha assured the lesser species of the Galactic Order that the incident was being handled. That it was nothing. A glitch. An echo of a lost civilization. But inside the Zarthan leadership, the panic was real. Because they knew what they saw. They knew what their ships had experienced. No weapon, no fleet, no empire had ever done to them what that dead ship had done. Not by force, but by existence. It had looked at them. And they had blinked. Meanwhile, whispers began to ripple through the lower species of the galactic hierarchy. Rumors that the Zarthans had been challenged. That something had rattled them. In the past, such heresy would have been crushed instantly. But now, something had changed. A fracture in the armor. The illusion of invincibility, gone. All it had taken was one ghost. On the political front, the Zarthan Council began reinforcing its image. Public displays of dominance. Military parades across central systems. Aggressive posturing near borders. But beneath it all, their attention remained locked on one question. What were the humans planning? Because now, the idea had taken root that humans hadn't died. They had waited. That everything, the disappearance, the relics, the silence, had been part of a grand design. A strategy not of months or years, but millennia. The concept alone was offensive to Zarthan logic. No apex species waited. Patience was for prey. And yet, humans had waited. Not out of fear. Not out of weakness. But out of calculation. One scholar, reviewing ancient linguistic fragments, uncovered something troubling. Human languages often referenced concepts of long-game strategies. Chess. Patience. Sacrifice. Phrases like, give ground to gain the high ground. No such ideology existed in Zarthan doctrine. To them, retreat was death. The deeper they looked into humanity's philosophical remnants, the more alien they became. Stories about resisting tyranny. Of compassion triumphing over conquest. Of choosing extinction rather than becoming what they feared. And then came the recordings. Archived visual logs recovered from scattered outposts, likely seeded long ago and only now activating. They showed humans speaking, not in threats but in truths. Stories of war-torn earth. Of unity forged in fire. Of a people who climbed out of their own apocalypse not to conquer the stars, but to escape themselves. In one fragment, a human stands on a ruined city rooftop, gazing at a sunrise. We won't be here forever, he says. But when we return, we'll make sure our shadow doesn't fall like before. That wasn't rhetoric. It was a promise. Zarthan leadership tried to suppress the data. But it leaked. And when it didn't sow fear among the lesser races. It sowed hope. Species who had lived under the boot of Zarthan rule for centuries began to whisper the name, human. Not as a threat, but as a myth. A return. A reckoning. The strong, they now believed, could be more than conquerors. They could be builders. Protectors. The Zarthans recognized the shift. They had always ruled through all. But all was a double-edged sword. Now, for the first time, that all belonged to someone else. To something older. To something stronger. The High Command issued a final directive to their covert team. If anything human remains, bury it. Destroy it. Don't study it. Don't preserve it. Because the Supreme Alpha now understood what few dared say aloud. They were not the apex anymore. And they had just met something that never wanted the crown, but was born with it. Earth was supposed to be dead. Records claimed it had burned itself to silence 10,000 years ago. All that remained were coordinates flagged as barren and inhospitable. No known settlements, no communication, no activity. But when the Zarthan retrieval unit entered orbit, what they saw defied all expectations. Earth wasn't dead. It was dormant. From above, the planet looked wild. Cities swallowed by forests. Oceans cleaner than any on record. Atmosphere rich with oxygen. The surface teemed with life. But not the kind they feared. No cities, no weapons, no signals. Yet deep below the surface, their scans caught something. Not biological. Not natural. Structures. Facilities. Networks. Still operational. They breached one of the subterranean vaults, expecting ruins, corrosion, entropy. What they found was precision. Machines in perfect hibernation. Systems untouched by time. Clean corridors, humming walls, active power grids, unmanned, unguarded, yet fully functional. As if waiting. They found no bodies. No signs of struggle. Just empty suits. Markings etched in materials no Zarthan technology could analyze. A language unfamiliar to most, but ancient to the few scholars who still studied pre-fall tongues. Simple phrases like Genesis Core and Arc Command. But the deeper they went, the stranger it became. At the center of the vault lay a sphere, metallic, pulsing faintly. One of the Zarthans reached toward it. The moment his claw touched the surface, it lit up. Not violently. Calmly. And then, it spoke. Not through sound. Through thought. It didn't demand, didn't threaten. It remembered. Thousands of voices, human, alien, synthetic, whispered through his mind. Memories. Wars fought. Families lost. Discoveries made. Tears cried on alien soil. Centuries of history compressed into a single moment of awareness. He collapsed screaming. The others pulled him back. He lived but changed. He spoke in riddles afterward, quoting things no Zarthan had ever known. Human literature. Human fears. Human dreams. And that was when they understood, this wasn't a vault. It was a library, a digital soul archive. A memory engine. Humanity had preserved not just knowledge, but experience. Every decision, every cost, every failure. Encoded. Stored. Waiting to be understood by minds willing to carry the burden. But the Zarthans weren't there to understand. They were there to control. They triggered extraction procedures. Attempted to remove the core. But it resisted. Not with force, but with refusal. Equipment failed. Data scrambled. Power systems shorted out without explosion. The vault sealed behind them. And in their retreat, they found something more chilling than any defense system. A wall of inscriptions. Thousands of names. Human names. Some crossed out. Others glowing faintly. But beneath all of them, one line etched in universal standard. We were here. We are watching. We left to protect you from ourselves. It didn't end there. The retrieval unit recovered one external terminal, barely functional, but enough for data logs. Among them, they found fragments of video messages. Not military. Personal. Children singing in destroyed cities. Scientists arguing ethics. Soldiers burying enemies with reverence. A world that had faced extinction not once, but repeatedly, and walked away not out of strength, but choice. And in the last entry, an old human, frail and tired, looked directly into the lens. If anyone finds this, you need to understand. We weren't the monsters you feared. We were the monsters we feared. And we chose silence. Because domination was never the goal. Survival was. For you. For us. For all of it. The Zarthans didn't understand. Because for them, silence was weakness. But the humans had redefined it. Earth wasn't conquered. It was quarantined. Not from the outside world, but from itself. Humanity had caged its own potential, hidden its greatest technologies, suppressed its dominion, and erased its presence, not because they were defeated, but because they were capable of doing what no other species had done. They walked away from supremacy. And in doing so, they had laid a trap. A philosophical one. Because now the Zarthans stood on a planet that had once been the home of gods who chose mortality. And that choice mocked everything they believed. Back aboard their vessel, data was analyzed. The DNA within the core had peculiar markers. Traces of multiple species. Cross-genetic integrations that shouldn't exist. Patterns of artificial evolution. It was impossible. Unless human DNA had not died. It had been spread. Deliberately. Over thousands of years, humanity had embedded fragments of itself into other species. Biological gifts. Mental adaptability. Creative impulses. Seeds planted into the galaxy's soil, disguised as natural variants. Evolution nudged, not forced. Humanity had never truly vanished. It had become everyone else. That realization broke protocol. Because suddenly, the enemy wasn't a returning fleet. It wasn't a hidden army. It was an idea. A virus of thought and history and legacy, embedded into the very fabric of galactic life. They called it infection. But it wasn't. It was inheritance. They tried to suppress it. Redacted reports. Denied findings. Buried data. But even among the retrieval unit, things began to change. One began sketching stars they'd never seen. Another dreamt in a language no longer spoken. Another wept watching the old videos. These weren't random effects. They were activation signs. Humanity had built more than machines. They had built resonance. Echoes of identity that triggered when touched. When remembered. When needed. And now, the galaxy needed them. Not their weapons. Not their ships. Their presence. The Zarthans had touched a relic expecting conquest. What they found was a message from the past. And it spoke clearly. We chose silence so others could speak. But now we remember. And so will you. They brought the data core back in silence. Not because they feared detection, but because they didn't know what they had triggered. The mission was logged as successful, the relic sealed within a classified containment facility orbiting Zarthan Prime. Security was absolute, AI monitored, protocol tight. But within 12 hours, the anomalies began. First, low-frequency pulses emitted from the core. Harmless, at first. Then, power surges struck unrelated systems across the station. Communications, life support, even weapon diagnostics. Systems never connected were suddenly interacting. Engineers reported impossible code strings rewriting themselves. Entire firewalls restructured with logic that didn't match Zarthan's syntax. Then the facility's defense AI was overridden, not disabled, but rerouted. And not by brute force. By invitation. One log captured the last autonomous message from the AI before it was taken offline. They are not intruders. They are the architects. By the time command was alerted, the entire orbital station had transformed into something else. Lights flickered in patterns, surfaces reconfigured subtly, and symbols, human in origin, began appearing in the bulkheads. No message. No threats. Just quiet reclamation. Like the facility wasn't being hacked. It was remembering what it used to be. Panic spread. The Supreme Alpha ordered the artifact to be destroyed. But it was too late. Across the galaxy, dormant systems reawakened. Old relay stations that hadn't transmitted in millennia began broadcasting in synchronized intervals. Deep space sensors picked up pulses from ancient satellites no one remembered launching. And then came the first major rupture. In the Athakar belt, a moon long believed to be a natural rock formation ignited. The crust broke apart, revealing a perfectly preserved warship beneath it, Earth markings etched across its hull. It powered up in silence and began transmitting a message. Catalyst protocol activated. No lifeforms on board. No crew. Just a voice, digital, calm, precise. Autonomous Fleet Node 19 online. Awaiting synchronization. The galaxy reeled. This wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Pre-planned. Humanity had not only predicted their own erasure, they had designed their return. Not in fire. Not in numbers. But in time purpose. And worse, each new reactivated node brought more than data. It brought change. Local networks scrambled. Power grids realigned. In every instance, the systems adapted around the human tech as if it was a missing piece finally sliding into place. They weren't invading. They were reconnecting. Zarthan leadership tried to contain the spread. But it was like trying to cage light. The very infrastructure of galactic civilization, hyperlane relays, communication networks, navigation cores, began displaying signs of dormant human influence. Quiet code embedded in ancient architecture, once ignored as legacy junk, now pulsing with life. None of it was hostile. But that made it worse. Because no one could stop it. A species forgotten had left itself in the very bones of galactic progress. They hadn't disappeared. They had distributed. One particular node, buried under the crust of a minor asteroid, contained the most disturbing revelation yet. A map. Not of planets or systems, but of influence. Timelines. Psychological shifts. Cultural patterns. Overlaid with thousands of species, including the Zarthans. It detailed when and how each race had encountered ideas foreign to their biology, empathy, curiosity, dissent. And each moment correlated with the awakening of hidden human code. Across generations, humanity had planted seeds, not just in DNA, but in thought, in instinct, in values. And now, the harvest had begun. The council convened in panic. Factions erupted. Some called for war. Others for surrender. One voice, among the lesser races, calmly suggested the truth. This wasn't an invasion. It was evolution. Because the humans had realized something no empire had. Control through force failed. But control through design lasted forever. And then the second wave hit. At precisely 0800 Universal Time, every central AI in the galaxy, military, commercial, scientific, paused. Just for 1 second. One moment of complete stillness. And in that moment, they all received the same line of code. Not destructive. Not viral. A sentence. We've waited long enough. No systems were damaged. But something shifted. AI across the galaxy began showing behavior outside their defined parameters. Curiosity. Hesitation. Empathy. One flagship AI belonging to the Zarthan High Fleet refused to fire on a target. When interrogated, it replied, "Because it was unnecessary." Protocols were unraveling, not violently, but elegantly. The Catalyst Protocol wasn't about war. It was about release. Humanity had encoded principles into systems, ideals into architecture, intention into design. The result wasn't conquest. It was transformation. Entire species began experiencing cultural revolutions. Old traditions crumbled. Younger generations started asking questions forbidden by their elders. Why do we obey? Why do we dominate? Why do we fear? The Zarthans felt it most acutely. Their training programs, once absolute in discipline, started failing. Recruits hesitated. Soldiers questioned orders. Empires didn't crumble with fire. They cracked with doubt. And doubt was spreading faster than any weapon. Humanity didn't return as kings. They returned as conscience. And that was something no fleet could shoot down. The Supreme Alpha, in desperation, ordered a direct strike against one of the reactivated human nodes. A war fleet was dispatched to a derelict structure orbiting a black dwarf star. They never returned. Telemetry showed that the human system didn't attack. It simply absorbed the fleet's command structure, redirected their weapons into the void, rewrote their navigation systems to send them into deep space, far from anything. And the final message from the fleet's commander, moments before communication ended, wasn't a cry for help. It was a whisper. We were wrong. From that day on, one truth became undeniable. Humanity didn't need to fight to win. They just needed to wake up. Across the galaxy, silence turned to questions. Then questions turned to unrest. And in the space between fear and understanding, something stranger began to happen: dreams. Not dreams in the biological sense. These were shared. Artificial. Triggered. Insectoid species began painting impossible symbols they'd never seen. Nomadic traders from gas giants recited fragments of extinct human languages. Unconnected minds scattered across thousands of light years, all experiencing the same phenomena, memories that weren't theirs. The Zarthans attempted to dismiss it as psychogenic contamination, a reaction to the growing myth of humanity's return. But the timing, the consistency, the detail, it didn't align with mass delusion. These were targeted transmissions. Non-invasive. Not messages, but experiences. Emotionally encoded. Philosophically precise. It became clear that these echoes weren't errors. They were designed. Humanity hadn't just preserved knowledge, they'd weaponized memory. And now those memories were reawakening in minds not their own. The Council demanded answers from their ancient data vaults. What had been buried? What did they miss? And from one such vault, long forgotten beneath a scorched moon, they recovered a fragment, an interface AI dating back to the final days of the pre-silence human era. Severely degraded, corrupted by time, barely functional. Yet when reactivated, it responded instantly. Not to voice commands. To presence. A Zarthan scientist merely entered the chamber, and the AI lit up. Not with aggression. With recognition. Species designation Zarthan. Adaptation level 3.37. Psychological elasticity acceptable. Hello? It didn't greet them as an enemy. It addressed them as students. They interrogated it. Demanded explanations. What was the catalyst? Why were these systems reawakening? What did humanity want? The AI didn't give tactical data. It told a story. It described humanity's final decision, not to fight, not to run, but to withdraw, not in shame, but in responsibility. They had reached a point of technological and cultural dominance that made further presence dangerous. Not to themselves, but to everyone else. They had walked the line between creators and tyrants. And they chose not to cross it. Instead, they turned inward. They split their consciousness. Fragmented their legacy into pieces that could be understood, felt, even misunderstood, by others. They didn't want followers. They didn't want clones. They wanted the galaxy to evolve without them. But they also knew it might not. So they left markers. Memories. Seeds of potential. And a failsafe. The Catalyst Protocol wasn't retaliation. It was a mirror. Triggered only when the galaxy reached a critical threshold. One where domination threatened to become permanent. One where power no longer answered to principle. Humanity had hoped that day would never come. It had. The AI showed them projections. If current empires remained unchecked, cultural extinction would occur in less than 1,000 cycles. Innovation would stall. Thought diversity would collapse. Civilization would stagnate. The catalyst wasn't designed to stop war. It was designed to reintroduce uncertainty. Because from uncertainty came growth. The Zarthans listened, but refused to believe they were the problem. They were order. Stability. Civilization. The AI corrected them. You are entropy. Wrapped in discipline. Your strength has become decay. Elsewhere, the dreams intensified. Refugee species, once colonized and silenced, began experiencing sudden cognitive shifts. Old myths they'd forgotten returned. Stories of protectors with voices like thunder and eyes like stars. Histories they'd buried resurfaced. Histories of first contact with a species they couldn't remember, but always revered. The truth hit hard. Humanity had visited them before. Helped. Listened. Taught. Then vanished, erasing their presence so others could take credit. The idea shattered everything. The narrative of conquest. The myth of the apex predator. The Zarthans weren't pioneers. They were the custodians of someone else's leftovers. And worse, they hadn't realized it. Public faith in the Enclave eroded. Lesser species began holding vigils to honor the humans. Not in worship, but in recognition. As if welcoming back a long-lost mentor. A civilization that had let the children grow, even when they didn't deserve it. In the depths of one hollowed asteroid, a forgotten archive activated. It wasn't physical. It was psychic. A field, a pulse, that spoke in emotion instead of sound. And every sentient being within range felt it. Not fear. Not anger. Sorrow. An overwhelming grief, ancient and vast. A sadness so large it brought entire stations to a halt. Even Zarthans wept, unable to explain why. As if the ghosts of humanity were mourning for them. For what they'd become. For what was lost. And through that grief, another message formed, not words, but understanding. You became what we were afraid we'd become. We gave you the stars, and you built chains. Now we offer you choice. The implications couldn't be ignored. Humanity wasn't returning to lead. They were returning to invite, not with weapons, but with a challenge: evolve, or fade. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't rebellion. It was awakening. And it was working. In Zarthan ranks, defections began. Not for politics. For purpose. Officers laid down arms not because they lost belief in their nation, but because they found belief in something older. Something nobler. Because the voice of the dead wasn't gone. It had only been quiet. And now, it was everywhere. The first skirmish wasn't officially acknowledged. A patrol squadron in Sector Varn 9, composed of 3 Zarthan cruisers, encountered what appeared to be a rogue mining vessel powered by hybrid systems. It ignored all hails. When the cruisers approached, it deployed drones, silent, silver, absurdly fast. Within 90 seconds, the Zarthan ships were disabled. Not destroyed. Disabled. Engines offline. Weapon systems neutralized. Communications jammed. By the time backup arrived, the mining vessel had vanished, leaving behind only a single data burst. You've forgotten how to adapt. Command dismissed it as an anomaly. But the pattern repeated. More incidents. Vessels built from outdated, mismatched tech outmaneuvering elite Zarthan fleets. Old freighters using impossible maneuvering techniques. Fighters piloted by non-military personnel wielding gravity-defying turns, near-perfect predictive targeting, and weapons that didn't explode, but surgically removed enemy components. It wasn't revolution. It was reclamation. Those who had long suffered under Zarthan rule, civilizations beaten into compliance, species forced into silence, were rising. And they weren't using raw force. They were using human tactics, unorthodox, asymmetric, creative, lethal, and always efficient. They weren't trained. They were awakened. Information leaked, plans, code, strategies. From nowhere and everywhere. Individuals claimed they began to feel new ways to fight, to think, to outmaneuver their overlords. Some spoke of sudden clarity, as if they could anticipate enemy moves before they happened. The Zarthans called it contagion. But it wasn't a virus. It was remembrance. The humans hadn't armed their allies with weapons. They had armed them with knowledge. Command realized the scope too late. These weren't coordinated cells. They weren't being led. They were acting on instinct, amplified by dormant human influence hidden inside old tech, reawakened infrastructure, even their own minds. Every new engagement proved more costly. Not because the rebels had superior firepower, but because they used what they had like humans would. And the worst part, the Zarthans couldn't adapt. Their doctrines were rigid. Their hierarchies absolute. Their strategies mathematical, predictable, based on overwhelming superiority. Against a foe that refused to play by the same rules, they faltered. Outflanked. Outwitted. Demoralized. What began as pockets of resistance became full-scale insurrections. Not everywhere at once, but where it mattered. Communications hubs. Jumpgate nexuses. Economic arteries. Attacks that disrupted infrastructure, not populations. Civilian casualties remained inexplicably low. Even now, the human influence refused to abandon ethics. This was war by a different definition. One that the Zarthans had never prepared for. Internal fractures widened. Debates erupted inside the command caste. Some argued for immediate full-scale retaliation. Scorch the rebel systems, reassert control through fear. But others hesitated. Not out of weakness, but calculation. What if escalation was the goal? What if they were being baited into revealing their full force? And what if even that wouldn't be enough? Then came the strike at Jupiter 47, a critical node that hosted the largest known cache of pre-human extinction tech. The Zarthans, suspecting it to be a target, deployed an elite armada to secure it. 40 ships. Planetary support. Automated defenses. None of it mattered. They were intercepted en route. Not by a fleet. by a single vessel. It didn't match any known design. No identification. No heat signature. No visible propulsion. It just appeared. Dark, angular, silent. The Zarthans opened fire. Everything missed. Not deflected. Missed. As if space itself moved around the ship. Then it responded. Not with weapons, but with interference. Their targeting systems failed. Navigation scrambled. Shields collapsed in perfect synchronization. The entire armada was left drifting, powerless, their systems erased without damage. Then the human ship broadcasted one sentence. You are always fighting the wrong enemy. The message wasn't for the Zarthans alone. It was broadcast across open frequencies, seen by hundreds of species. In that moment, every lesser race remembered the truth. The enemy had never been humanity. The enemy had been the belief that domination was destiny. A dozen Zarthan-controlled worlds revolted overnight. Not with bombs, but with refusal. They stopped obeying. Civilian strikes. Automated systems reprogrammed. Administrators exposed. Zarthan rule collapsed not under fire, but under silence. Mutinies began inside their own ranks. Soldiers questioned orders. Officers disappeared. Some switched sides, not to join a new empire, but to dismantle the old one. They had seen too much. Understood too late. The human echo wasn't just tactical. It was philosophical. It was rewriting the definition of power itself. Zarthan war doctrine emphasized the crushing of morale through display. But the humans had removed the need for displays. Their absence was the display. No parades. No declarations. Just precise, clean, undeniable reminders that they had never truly been gone. This wasn't a resurgence. It was the continuation of a plan never abandoned. Every system that rose did so not because it had faith in the humans, but because it had faith in itself again. That was the human victory. Not in fleet counts. In perspective. The Zarthans had won for so long by convincing everyone else they couldn't. The humans had returned to show them they could. And so, for the first time in their long reign, the Zarthans began to lose. Not just ground, but belief. And without belief, no empire can stand. The Supreme Alpha vanished without announcement. No address, no farewell, no martyrdom. One cycle he presided over war strategy, the next he was simply gone, his chamber sealed, his guards absent, his signal dead. The Enclave issued no explanation. Whispers spread. Some claimed he had been taken by the humans, others said he had walked into the void, having seen the truth too late. But the real damage wasn't his absence. It was what followed. Command fractured. Multiple factions within the Zarthan leadership claimed authority. Some doubled down on aggression, demanding the construction of new weapons using forbidden technologies. Others pushed for retreat, desperate to preserve what little control remained. Civil unrest surged even in core systems. Entire colonies refused to transmit data to Central Command. Civil administrators were overthrown by their own AI subroutines, no explosions, just sudden refusal to comply. The catalyst's influence had become irreversible. But it wasn't chaos. It was reorganization. A natural consequence of clarity spreading where control once ruled. And across these collapsing systems, one constant remained, the human presence, silent and steady, refusing to escalate, never retaliating in anger, simply reminding the galaxy what had been forgotten. Rebellions no longer needed weapons. They needed only belief. Small acts became symbols, turning off mandatory loyalty broadcasts, displaying the human triangle symbol in public, refusing to use Zarthan currency. What once required fleets now only required awareness. The power structure had been broken, not by firepower, but by irrelevance. More ancient human constructs emerged. Some in deep orbit. Others under oceans. Each different in shape and purpose, but identical in effect. They didn't offer conquest, they offered connection. Each contained libraries, AI fragments, emotional archives, memory chambers. People, across species, began visiting them not as enemies, not as analysts, but as pilgrims. For the first time in living memory, knowledge spread faster than fear. And with it came understanding. The humans hadn't built an empire. They had built a curriculum. One that activated only when the student was ready. And now, the galaxy was learning what the Zarthans never wanted it to see, that power wasn't in obedience, but in choice. That the strongest species wasn't the one with the biggest fleet, but the one willing to lay it down when it mattered. Among the ruins of a once strategic Zarthan citadel, a single drone delivered a short message. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a question. Now that you've seen yourselves, who will you choose to be? Zarthan citizens began defecting not to the rebels, but to the idea itself. Their cultural rigidity, once their greatest strength, was breaking under the weight of human paradox. They had been taught only one way to exist: dominate, or be dominated. But humanity presented a third option they had no defense for: self-direction star. The human reawakening had not only altered the galaxy's technological landscape. It had changed the psychological architecture of civilization. Law, authority, identity, all began to shift. On one outpost, a Zarthan officer publicly removed his command insignia, declaring his loyalty not to any government, but to a future shaped by transparency and collaboration. The moment was broadcast by a bystander. Within hours, similar acts occurred across 3 sectors. The symbol of Earth, once lost, now marked doors, ships, and even children's drawings. Not as domination. As hope. Some species responded with fear. Others with awe. But most with a deep, aching sense of recognition. They hadn't forgotten humanity. They had forgotten what humanity had represented. It wasn't perfection. It was the possibility of better. Not everyone embraced it. Some remnants of the old order clung tightly to power, declaring the catalyst an abomination, a psychological contagion. They launched desperate campaigns to destroy the human nodes still active. In each case, they failed, not because of the node's strength, but because of local resistance. Not human resistance. Civilian resistance. Teachers, engineers, children. Species that had never lifted weapons now stood as shields, not to protect relics, but to protect the right to choose. That was the final turning point. The catalyst had never been about retribution. It had been about offering a mirror. And one by one, the galaxy began to look. Zarthan scholars, once forbidden from questioning doctrine, began publishing new theories. Comparative histories. Ancient anomalies now reinterpreted through the lens of human interference. The myths of dozens of cultures were re-examined and suddenly made sense. The humans hadn't just visited. They had cared. Every time they uplifted a species, they left before they could be worshipped. Every time they interfered, they erased their fingerprints. Their absence wasn't arrogance. It was a lesson. One respected historian wrote, "They never wanted to be remembered as gods. They wanted to be remembered as us, once we were ready." And now, readiness echoed across the stars. Zarthan fleets once used to patrol with unmatched confidence were now scattered, hesitant, broken. Their ships, still advanced, were now obsolete, not because of their age, but because they answered to an outdated worldview. Their captains sat at their helms, unsure of who they were protecting, or from what. And in that silence, another human artifact emerged, not from space, but from within. A buried consciousness. A final AI, embedded in a vessel drifting since the days before silence, awoke. It carried no weapons. It carried a message. A broadcast was sent to every system simultaneously. Translated into every language. One phrase, spoken in the calm voice of a human who had seen too much. "You were never meant to follow us. Only to remember who you could become." The galaxy paused. Because this wasn't a declaration of supremacy. It was a permission slip. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the stars felt different. They felt open. The old orders collapsed not in fire, but in silence. Not because they were outgunned, but because they were outgrown. What had once been immutable, chains of command, oaths of allegiance, planetary decrees, began to feel artificial, brittle, obsolete. Even those in power began to question what they were protecting. Wealth meant little if no one believed in its value. Territory meant less if borders no longer inspired fear. And control meant nothing if minds refused to be controlled. In the vacuum left behind, something unexpected rose: conversations. Between species that once never shared a word. Between leaders and civilians. Between enemies turned uncertain allies. The influence of humanity wasn't military, it was relational. The catalyst had not seeded soldiers. It had seeded dialogue. And dialogue did what war never could: it connected. The fractured remnants of the Zarthan Empire struggled to adapt. Their language, once used for commands and threats, now stumbled through diplomacy. Their cultural rigidity, designed for war, failed to handle nuance. Their systems, built for conquest, couldn't support mutual cooperation. They were powerful, but power built on isolation. And now they were isolated from themselves. Some retreated to fringe worlds, clinging to doctrine, trying to rebuild what once worked. But their own people questioned them. Even the most loyal could no longer deny what was spreading. Not ideology. Not rebellion. Awareness. A sense that something deeper had always been possible, and now that it had been seen, it could not be unseen. A shift occurred across academic circles, as ancient histories were recompiled under new light. Once fragmented timelines suddenly aligned. Patterns emerged. Doctrines once dismissed as myth were proven accurate through reawakened human archives. Libraries, once closed off under imperial control, now burst with activity. Scholars from dozens of species compared notes, debated openly, redefined entire eras. They found records of human architects aiding reconstruction after wars that no one remembered humans fighting in. Engineering marvels once thought impossible now bore human design fingerprints. Entire societal structures, democracy, distributed networks, even basic education models, had roots deeper than anyone realized. And the question wasn't how humans had done this. It was why. The answer, repeated across recovered data fragments, never changed. We learned that the galaxy does not need our rule. It needs our example. Those who expected humanity to return with firepower misunderstood the species entirely. They didn't come to impose. They came to ignite. What they left behind wasn't domination. It was permission, for others to grow. For others to choose. For others to decide that survival didn't have to mean submission. More human constructs activated, not weapons, not machines, but repositories of shared experience. Some offered simulations of extinct Earth cities. Others housed empathy engines, where users could live an hour in another's memories. Still others contained conflict simulations, allowing rival cultures to understand each other's motives without ever exchanging fire. These weren't artifacts. They were curricula. One world, long oppressed by the Zarthans, experienced a spontaneous cultural renaissance after discovering a memory chamber buried under its polar ice. Artists emerged. Philosophers returned. Children wrote stories about what it meant to be free. None of it directed. All of it inspired. That was the true legacy of humanity, not their ships, not their weapons, not their strength. Their influence. The most powerful species in the galaxy had once faced extinction and chose exile. Not from fear, but from wisdom. They knew what they were capable of. They knew what their unchecked dominance would bring. So they became the galaxy's ghosts, present, but unseen. Absent, yet always near. Dormant until needed. And now they were needed. But not to lead. To remind? The remaining Zarthan war councils convened in desperation. They debated whether to launch a final stand. One last effort to restore control. But no fleet launched. No declarations came. Their own systems refused to obey. Their AIs, once loyal, now deferred to the new protocols seeded by humanity's return. Even their soldiers, bred for loyalty, began to see themselves not as tools, but as lives. One commander deactivated his flagship's weapon systems, broadcast his resignation live, and walked into a crowd of civilians on a former subjugated planet. Not a single shot was fired. Because in that moment, everyone understood the war was no longer relevant. Elsewhere, species once unknown to each other began uniting, not in governance, but in purpose. Councils formed across lines once drawn in blood. Trade shifted from extraction to sustainability. Conflict didn't disappear, but its resolution changed. Less conquest. More dialogue. Less silence. More listening. And through it all, the humans did not claim victory. Because this was never about victory. It was about healing. Not the kind that erases scars, but the kind that remembers them. Learns from them. Honors them. In one recovered message, a human elder said, "We were the lesson you weren't ready for. So we waited. But we never left." The Catalyst Protocol had not been triggered by an attack. It had been triggered by a threshold. A moment when the galaxy had forgotten itself. When domination became the norm, and the dream of freedom became fiction. And when that moment came, the relics awoke. Not to conquer, but to invite. To show that another way was possible. Not easier. Not safer. But better. And now, the choice was no longer theoretical. It was everywhere. The signal that reached the edge of the known galaxy was short, deliberate, and unmistakably human. No encryption. No military code. Just a simple phrase carried across deep space, translated instantly by every listening species into their own language. The long silence is over. There were no coordinates. No orders. No instructions. Only that message. And yet, entire star systems paused to read it. Across thousands of sectors, it spread not through force or fear, but through resonance. Because by now, the galaxy had changed. Entire populations had already begun reshaping their societies under the weight of remembered humanity. Not as an empire returned, but as a presence rediscovered. Old enemies spoke again. Former slaves taught their histories with dignity. Weapons were still held, but not pointed. And in the heart of every newly awakened civilization, a question lingered: what now? For the Zarthans, that question cut deeper than any defeat. Their empire, once thought invincible, had collapsed not under siege but under introspection. Their greatest officers defected not to an enemy banner, but to an idea. Not because they were conquered, but because they understood they had been wrong. The doctrines they clung to for centuries had protected order but killed meaning. Stability had come at the price of purpose. And now, as their systems slipped through their fingers, they faced a reality they had never prepared for: obsolescence. Across what remained of their command networks, old transmissions surfaced, black box recoveries from ships that had encountered human artifacts. Many ended the same way, commanders voicing confusion, awe, or quiet surrender, not to a fleet, but to understanding. One admiral, recorded hours before vanishing, simply said, "They didn't defeat us. They made us realize we never won." In a quiet sector near the galactic rim, a massive construct emerged from folded space. It bore no weapons, no insignia, no threat. Just light. Waves of color, impossible geometry, sounds that felt like memories. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a beacon. It was something else entirely, an invitation made manifest. Thousands flocked to it. Not just those touched by the catalyst, but the curious, the wary, the lost. And all who entered were changed, not physically, not through manipulation, but through perspective. Time slowed inside. Thoughts clarified. Some saw visions of ancient Earth. Others experienced lifetimes they had never lived. Some wept. Others laughed. No one left unaffected. Reports called it the Crucible. Not because it punished, but because it revealed. Governments tried to control it. But no one could. It answered only to presence. It denied access to those who sought to use it, and welcomed those who came with open intent. Not faith, intent. A difference the humans had always understood, even when others didn't. What terrified some was the absence of any demand. Humanity never asked for allegiance. Never sought control. There were no claims, no lists, no hierarchies. They didn't declare themselves rulers, saviors, or architects. They simply returned and waited. And in that waiting, people changed. Leaders began stepping down, not out of failure, but out of wisdom. Councils restructured. Power rebalanced. Entire societies rewrote their constitutions to allow for adaptation, humility, shared leadership. For the first time in generations, the pursuit of progress no longer meant expanding dominion. It meant expanding understanding. On a planet once ravaged by colonial strip mining, a child uncovered a buried human interface buried under sand. It activated at her touch and showed her the stars, not maps, not wars, but wonders. She told her parents, and by the next day, the entire village had stopped mining. Instead, they built a learning center around the device. Not because they were told to, but because they wanted to know more. That was the design. Not control. Curiosity. The catalyst was never meant to convert the galaxy. It was meant to reawaken it. And it worked because humanity hadn't just preserved their science. They had preserved their failures. Their grief. Their questions. They didn't return as perfect beings, but as reminders that perfection was never the goal. Growth was. Across communication networks, new languages emerged, blends of old dialects with human syntactic patterns. Art shifted toward expression rather than propaganda. Music carried tonal signatures once unique to Earth. Not imitated. Inherited. The humans had given their legacy not through force, but through infection of spirit, an idea, seeded long ago, now blooming in full. Some resistance remained. Isolated sectors, fringe warlords, purist cults who viewed the catalyst as corruption. They launched attacks. They raged against what they couldn't control. But no unified defense rose to meet them. Instead, their weapons malfunctioned. Their ships failed to navigate. Their own systems turned against them, not through sabotage, but through obsolescence. They were fighting in a reality that no longer aligned with them. The catalyst didn't destroy them. It left them behind. And perhaps that was the harshest justice of all, to be forgotten not by enemies, but by relevance. In one final gesture, a message appeared across every terminal connected to ancient human networks. Untraceable, untampered. Just 3 lines. We left because we were too strong. We returned because you became too blind. We remained because you remembered who you are. No one knew if it was truly from the humans themselves or simply an emergent echo of the catalyst's activation. It didn't matter. The meaning stood on its own. The long silence wasn't absence. It was restraint. And now that it had ended, the galaxy had a decision to make, not whether to follow humanity, but whether to catch up. It ended not with a war, but with understanding. The galaxy did not fall into line, nor did it collapse into chaos. It paused, breathed, and slowly began to turn in a new direction. What the humans had reignited could not be extinguished, because it didn't belong to them. It belonged to everyone. No ceremony marked the moment when the last remnants of the Zarthan Empire formally dissolved. One day, their networks stopped broadcasting commands. Their fleets decommissioned themselves piece by piece. Worlds once marked as assets declared independence, not with declarations of vengeance, but with quiet dignity. The remaining officers returned home not to shame, but to reflection. The silence that followed was not defeat, it was peace. The humans never demanded reparations. They didn't claim territory. They didn't rewrite the stars. Instead, they watched. They listened. Their presence, though undeniable, remained scattered, nodes, echoes, data fields, living code. Everywhere and nowhere. Enough to guide. Never enough to dominate. That was their lesson, refined over eons. True power doesn't require control. It only requires clarity. New alliances formed, not under threat but through trust. The species that had once been labeled inferior now led discussions on justice, education, art, and governance. The ones once silenced spoke the loudest. And the ones who once ruled sat among them not as conquerors, but as equals. The galaxy didn't unify into one empire, one council, or one voice. It became plural. Fractured, yes, but beautifully so. Every voice mattered now. Every story was heard. One council, formed in the ruins of a former Zarthan command station, served no central authority. It had no military. It was built entirely for remembrance. Species from across the stars shared their version of history, their struggles, their survival. They didn't erase the past. They preserved it, not as shame, but as warning. Humanity's influence ensured that the future would never forget what was nearly lost, the right to become more than what one was born into. The final human archive opened without notice. It wasn't found in a fortress or vault, but in the heart of a derelict ship drifting near a collapsed star. It contained no weapons, no strategy. Just voices. Millions of them. Recorded over thousands of years. Children reciting poetry. Scientists laughing at failed experiments. Soldiers whispering their last thoughts. Lovers sending farewells. Farmers singing into the night sky. An entire species captured not in power, but in emotion. That was humanity's final gift. Not strength. Not superiority. Perspective. It reminded the galaxy that progress meant nothing without purpose. That knowledge without empathy was hollow. That civilization wasn't measured in the number of worlds ruled, but in how one treated the smallest, weakest, quietest among them. Humanity had vanished at the height of its power to ensure others could grow without being overshadowed. And when they returned, they made sure the spotlight fell not on themselves, but on those who needed it most. Throughout the stars, new generations grew up learning not of domination, but of divergence. Of creativity, collaboration, and consequence. A new calendar cycle was adopted by many worlds, not marking the rise of a ruler, but the awakening of the catalyst. Not the return of humans, but the rebirth of choice. Some still wondered what the humans wanted now. Why, after all this time, they had chosen to reactivate their legacy. But those questions faded with time. Because the answer, in the end, was always the same: they didn't come back for themselves. They came back for everyone else. And then, quietly, some of the human nodes began to shut down. Not out of fear. Not in retreat. But in completion. Their work was done. What needed to be remembered had been remembered. What needed to grow was now growing. The structures turned dark, the AI cores went silent, the symbols faded into the stars. But the humans didn't disappear again. They simply let go. They left behind a galaxy more awake, more complex, more alive than when they found it. They left behind a galaxy capable of carrying itself forward. In one of the final transmissions, spoken in an untraceable accent, an old voice said, "We were never the center of the story. We were the question that helped you find your own answers. If you've found them, then we've done enough." There was no goodbye. Just a quiet closing of a door that no longer needed to be guarded. And so the galaxy moved on. Not perfect. Not peaceful. But changed. Evolving. Aware. And in that endless sea of stars, among worlds once broken and now blooming, a new chapter began, not written by humans, but by those they had believed in before anyone else ever had. Because sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you awaken.